Hello, friends. Welcome. This is Dr. Kazmi, and today we are going to talk about the testing in COVID-19. To start with, we have at the moment two types of tests to diagnose COVID-19. The first one is the what we call as the real-time reverse transcriptase PCR testing, which actually looks for the viral load in your blood or in different types of your body secretions, especially if you have taken swab from the nasopharyngeal area. So it is looking at the presence of the viral particles in those secretions. The other type of testing that has recently become available is known as the antibody testing, which actually looks for the levels of antibodies against COVID-19 antigens in your blood. So these are the two different types of testings, and the way that they are actually used uh, in diagnosis of COVID-19 is a bit different because the real-time PCR testing is usually used in an acute phase of this disease to diagnose whether a person is having an infection at the moment and whether he is infective and can transmit infections to the others, while antibody testing is more of a thing where you are basically looking at whether the person has had an infection in the past, or whether they have developed effective antibodies if they had the infection in the past, and whether they are now immune to the disease or not. So we will be taking these different types of tests one by one, and we'll start with the real-time reverse transcriptase PCR testing. So to start with, this is a technique in which what you do is you take swabs from different areas of the body. Most commonly, we use swabs from the nasopharyngeal area. So usually two swabs are taken. One is taken from the nose, the other is taken from the oropharynx. And then these swabs are taken to the laboratory, where they are put in a machine which has got a buffer and which has got certain probes. So the principle behind these tests is that if there, let's say there is a viral RNA in the secretions, so what would happen is that uh, the reverse transcription process would take place in the machine. Normally, DNA is translated into RNA. But in this particular case, the reverse happens. So the viral RNA, if it is present, it would be translated back into DNA, and then an amplification process is done in which multiple copies of the DNA are made. I mean, it usually goes in millions and billions, and it is actually amplified to an extent where a probe, if it detects the specific nucleotide sequence for which is very much specific for COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 virus, then it would highlight that particular part of the code, and it would give you a positive on that particular testing on that particular machine. So that's how you test a person whether a person has got COVID-19 based on that or not. So it's a reverse transcription process in which the viral RNA is converted into DNA, and then it is amplified. And if a particular COVID-19 sequence is detected by the probe, then it highlights, and that how it is will give you a positive test. But there have been problems with this real-time reverse transcriptase PCR testing. And again and again, it has been seen that this test has got low sensitivity. And low sensitivity means that you will be getting what we call as false negative. So there would be a percentage of people who would have the infection, but their test would come out to be negative. And why that is important? Because let's say if somebody is infected and test comes out to be negative, then that person is pretty much confident that he doesn't have the infection. He can go out, he can continue his normal life, while in fact he is harboring the virus and he can transmit it to other people. So the infection can spread. So that's why the sensitivity is very important for any screening test. In this particular case, the researchers have seen that like at best, the sensitivity is around 70 to 75% of the cases. In other words, if I put it down into simple word, it simply means that if you take 100 people who actually have COVID-19, so what would happen if you do the this real-time reverse transcriptase PCR on them? So at best, 70 to 75% of them, they would show a positive PCR test, while 25 to 30% of them would still have a negative test, despite the fact that they are harboring virus in their body. Now, why this is important? Because as I told you earlier, that if it comes out to be falsely negative and you've got 25 to 30% false negative people, these are the people who can spread it, and that how the disease can spread without being detected. It also depends. Now, the question is why the sensitivity is low. Number one, because the way this test is conducted, it depends on the viral load, in the secretions from where you have taken the swab. For example, if the viral load is low, the virus is still there, but the number of the copies of the virus in that particular amount of the secretions that you have taken for testing, if that is below a particular threshold, then it's going to come out as negative, though the viral load is still there. Many times we have seen in practice that people had initial testing positive, then after a few days they had a few tests negative, and then again it came out to be positive. So people were worried whether they had reinfection, what was going on. And probably that can be explained by the low sensitivity of this test, that in the initial stages of the disease, you can have, because viral load is high, you can get a positive, but as the disease goes down, then you can have a negative. And let's say something happens again, like for example, your immunity is still down, your immune response again takes a dive, then the virus can replicate again, and then it becomes detectable again. So that can explain why some people have got positive, then negative, and then positive real-time PCR test. It also depends on from where you have taken the swabs. Like let's say if there's a predominantly lower respiratory tract infection, and in that phase of the disease you take swabs from the nasopharynx area, it might come out to be negative. But if you take, let's say, bronchoalveolar lavage, there'll be more chances of getting positive RNA from those secretions as compared to taking it from the nose. So as I said, real-time PCR has got problems of low sensitivity, and at best the sensitivity is around 70 to 75%. Now coming down to the second type of testing, which has been recently made available, and there's so much variety in the market at the moment, and that is the antibody-based testing. So what it does is that it looks for the presence of antibodies in your body. So it's basically looking at the antibodies if they are present in your blood. So you basically need a blood sample to run these tests. Some of them are available, for commercial use. They can be purchased over the counter as well, where you can just give yourself a finger prick, and you can put a drop of blood on the cassette, and that can give you the results within 5 to 10 minutes. But nevertheless, again, there has been a question about the sensitivity and specificity of these tests, to which I will come later on. So basically, there are two types of antibodies to SARS-CoV-2 when we get an infection, and if we developed antibodies to them. So the first is the IgM. So IgM is the acute phase antibody. So the principle is that once the virus starts replicating in the body, then the host immune response produces antibodies, specific antibodies against the viral antigens, and then they start fighting the antigen and they start to destroy the virus. So over a period of time, what happened that as the virus load starts going down, the antibody response starts going up. So low virus starts going down, antibody starts going up. And there are two types of antibodies. I said IgM is the acute phase, while the IgG is the late phase, which starts developing after some time, once the infection has settled and it's probably going down, then you have got a secondary response in the form of IgG, which stays for a longer period of time as compared to the IgM antibodies. Now, so what happens in COVID-19 is that, let's say, by day 7, the body starts producing IgM. Then by 10 days, IgG starts getting produced, and over a period of time, then the levels of these two increases. But the IgM is then quicker to go down, while IgG stays for a longer period of time. So normally the question is, let's say, if IgM is positive, what does that mean? Is the person infective or is he immune? So let's say by day 7 or by 10, if the IgM is positive, and the question is the person still shedding the virus? Well, maybe. Let's say if you find after some time that the IgM is positive and the IgG is also positive, is this person shedding virus? Okay, maybe. If after some time IgM is negative and IgG is positive, well, is this person still sharing virus? Well, we don't know, because at this point in time, we do not have enough data to understand the very much intricacies of how the immune system is working, especially in the form of late phase of this disease, and what does that mean for public health response. So the other thing is that many people might not develop antibodies at all. There has been an estimate that probably 1/5 of the people with COVID-19, they may not produce antibodies at all. So what about those people? So there is a lot of uncertainty about antibody testing at the moment. In UK, the antibody testing for masses has recently been started. They've started by testing the key workers, and I think very soon the mass testing will be rolled out for the general masses as well. So the basic purpose of this antibody testing is to look at the prevalence of the disease. So they are trying to see how much is the seroconversion in the general population. And having said that, what I think that basically testing is only good for the purpose that it's being done for. I mean, let's say if you're doing testing for public health purposes, testing per se doesn't help in control of the pandemic unless and until that testing is followed by tracking, tracing, and quarantine. So let's say if you are doing testing and doing testing for the sake of testing, that's not going to give you, any betterment in the situation. But if that testing is followed by tracing, tracking, and quarantine of the people, and I'm talking about not those people who are, if we are doing on antibody, I'm talking about those, the real-time PCR testing, that if you are doing that, and you have to either, number one, you have to do it repeated times because of the low sensitivity, and if you do it and you find positive, then those people need to be traced, their contact need to be traced and tracked, and they need to be put in quarantine. But if we come down to the antibody-based testing, the antibody-based testing are generally good enough to see what percentage of the population has got the antibodies. In other words, what percentage of the population has got seroconversion, and seroconversion is because they probably had an infection in the past. So there is another caveat here that for antibody testing and to have a meaningful interpretation of if we are applying it on a mass level also means that these antibody testing should have a very high specificity. In other words, let's say if the antibodies testing hasn't got 100% specificity, then what would happen? Let's say if the prevalence is low, let's say only 5% of the population was infected by COVID-19. So if the specificity is 95%, so the positive predictive value in that case turns out to be only 48%. In other words, 52% of the people would have false positive antibody testing. In other words, they would be having a false reassurance that they have got antibodies, and that's why they are immune. So it always depends on the prevalence. So where the prevalence is quite high, the positive predictive value goes up, and then it becomes more meaningful. So that's why we need a test which has got 100% specificity, because let's say if it had passed the prevalence is around 5 to 7%, then only a test which has got 100% specificity tell us for sure that these people are really immune and there are no false positives in such a case. So these are, the basic issues with the real-time PCR testing and the antibody testing. So to summarize it, real-time PCR tests actually have an issue with low sensitivity, and that's why all those who come out to be negative, it doesn't mean that they are not getting the disease. And similarly, it goes for the antibody testing. Unless until we've got an antibody testing which is 100% specific, we would be having issues with positive predictive value. So we'll be having a low positive predictive value. So low positive predictive value simply means that you'll be having a lot of false positive people, and false positive simply means false reassurance in that particular case. So if we are keeping our fingers crossed and we are seeing if in the near future we get an antibody-based testing, which is 100% specific, then it would mean a long way in actually looking at the real prevalence in the community and see how much of the people have been symptoms. So thank you very much for listening to this lecture. Again, this seems to be a bit more technical, but anyhow, if you have got any questions or queries, just ask me down in the comment section below. Please do subscribe to my channel to keep yourself updated as I upload new videos. Thank you very much. Bye.